Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Smart City Tutors and Smart City Kids Upper Level ISEE and SSAT 101 workshop. We're going to be going over everything you need to know if your child is taking the ISEE or the SSAT in the coming year. So to get started, we're going to talk a bit about who we are. So my name is Leila Smiley. I am the Director of Education and Operations at Smart City Tutors. And on this webinar with me is my colleague, Jackie Sirgo. She is the K-12 and boarding admissions consultant at Smart City Kids. So before we get started, I do want to give it just a little bit of background about Smart City Kids and Smart City Tutors. So Smart City Kids is the leading educational consulting company committed to helping students unlock their highest potential and reach their academic goals. For over 20 years, our consultants have successfully guided families through the challenging admissions process and have helped students gain admission to their top choice schools, including K-12, nursery, college, boarding, and special education. We take the stress out of the admissions process with concierge-level support and personalized programs to fit each student's goals and needs. All of our consultants are former admissions officers at top schools across the country, and they know exactly what makes a successful application. And at Smart City Tutors, we teach students the skills, strategies, and confidence they need to flourish in the classroom and beyond. In addition to academic support in all subject areas, we also provide our students with test preparation and executive functioning coaching. Everything we do is geared towards meeting each student's unique needs and academic goals. So just some background about me. I have been overseeing Smart City Tutors for several years now. Before that, I was an elementary school teacher. I taught kindergarten and second grade. While teaching, I did realize my favorite part of the job was working one-on-one and in small group. So then I transitioned a few years ago into tutoring. I began in academics, but then quickly transitioned again into test prep. So I've done a good amount of academic coaching with students. I've worked with students with various learning needs, and I also I've done a lot of ISEE and SSAT prep. So I am pretty well versed in these tests as well. Jackie, would you like to share a bit about yourself and your background?
Thank you so much, Leila. My name is Jackie Sirgo. I have been with Smart City Kids for 2 years now. Prior to that, I was the Director of Admissions at the Spire School, which is located in Manhattan. It is a school for gifted and talented students. I was part of the Spire community for over a decade. And prior to that, I was working in admissions at Barnard College, and then spent a few years there before that I was the placement director for a K-8 school called the School at Columbia. And then my work there began working for a nonprofit organization on Columbia University's campus, helping students gain access to both middle schools and colleges. And so making sure that it was a clear representation of students from across all communities and were of low income. So pretty much I focused my whole life on access and equity and admissions and placement. And I really enjoy working with families, but most importantly, finding the most appropriate fit for their children.
Excellent. Thank you, Jackie. So before we really jump in, I also want to share that Smart City Tutors is pleased to offer a promotion to the attendees of today's sessions. So if you purchase a package of 4 or more private tutoring sessions, we will add an additional complimentary bonus session. So that's 5 for the price of 4. So with that being said, let's get started. So just an overview of what we'll be covering in today's workshop. So we're going to go through what are the ISEE and SSAT, what does each test consist of, testing and test prep timelines, how does the SHSAT factor in, and how can you build a roadmap to help your child prepare for the tests they'll be taking. I'm very excited about this. This is something I discuss with parents on a almost daily basis. So we're about to jump in, go over everything that we're asked about the tests. So we're going to start with the ISEE, and we're going to go through all the different sections, what's on each test, how you should prepare, what's coming. So the ISEE, those letters stand for the Independent School Entrance Exam. It's hosted by the ERB, the Educational Records Bureau. This may sound familiar. Your students may have taken other tests given by the Educational Records Bureau. The ISEE is about 2.5 hours long, and it has 5 sections, 4 multiple choice and 1 essay. Here is a breakdown of the different sections. Section 1 is verbal reasoning. It is 40 questions and you have 20 minutes to complete. We're going to go through all the sections point by point a little later, but just an overview. Section 2 is quantitative reasoning. That's 37 questions in 35 minutes. Section 3 is reading comprehension, 36 questions, 6 passages in 35 minutes. Math achievement, 47 questions, 40 minutes. And finally, an essay. You get 1 prompt and it is 30 minutes. So let's start with the verbal reasoning section. Let's discuss what that consists of. So it starts with synonym questions. You'll see on the left. So for that, students are given a series of questions where they just are given 1 word and have to pick the word that most closely matches the definition of the provided word. Then they have single blank questions. So they get a sentence, they fill it in with a single answer choice, and a double blank, same thing, but two blanks. This is a section where test prep really comes in handy because of course students can prepare with vocabulary lists, they can learn a bunch of new words, but at the end of the day, they're probably still going to see words they don't know. So that's where we can prepare them. By especially in those sentence questions, they can start looking for clues in the sentence to give them guidance on what kind of answer we're looking for. But especially in those synonyms, kids, there's a lot of strategies. What happens, you've memorized all your vocab words and you still get a question and you don't know what that word means. You can look for context clues, we can look for word parts, all of those things can be factored in. So even if we can't narrow it down to the perfect answer, even if we can eliminate some of those, that definitely increases your chances of scoring highly here. So we're actually going to move on to the reading section. Remember, that's the 3rd section. We're going to talk about the math sections together. The reading comprehension is 36 questions, 6 passages, 6 questions each. You have 35 minutes. And there's 3 basic question types. You have your main idea questions. You have your detail questions where you go back in the passage and find specific details. And inferencing where you have to consolidate information you've read and come up with your own answer. So a note about the ISEE reading comprehension. The passages are a bit more straightforward than the SSAT. We'll get there. They are typically just narrative passages or nonfiction passages. They're not very literary. They're just more direct passages. One thing to note here is that this is a major area where students run out of time. So if your student is a slower reader, there's going to be some strategy regarding how to move through the passages quickly, how to answer these questions quickly and efficiently. So another thing to note is that the question types do end up repeating themselves. So this is an area where the more you practice with specific ISEE passages, the better you're going to get at each passage or at each question type, I mean. Moving on to the math sections. So there's 2 math sections, each is scored separately. So you're going to get your own score for each one. First is quantitative reasoning and second is math achievement. Both sections have no calculators allowed and are all multiple choice. So the main difference between these 2 sections is that the quantitative reasoning tends to be a bit more critical thinking heavy. So it's going to be more word problems, more information applied in a new context. The math achievement section is a bit more straightforward, just do you know how to do these questions or not? One major thing to note about the math sections. On the ISEE, the math sections have a real wide breadth of topics that they cover. So even if your student is a math whiz, they're doing excellent at school, they're probably going to need to learn new content for this test. This test also exceeds their curriculum. So if students currently are in 7th, they're going to be applying next fall, they'll be in 8th grade. We have content here that goes through 9th, even sometimes early like 10th grade topics. You're going to see geometry. You're going to see some very simple trigonometry. You're going to see a lot of algebra. They're not, the math here is not super difficult math, but it's a lot of new math. So if you're looking at preparing for the ISEE, I definitely recommend allowing your student a lot of time to prepare and learn new math topics. Now, finally, we're moving on to the essay. So the essay is unscored, but it is sent to schools. So you're not going to get your C9 or percentile score, but the schools look at it. And you got to make sure you've got this covered. And so the essay topics on the ISEE are pretty direct. You're going to write a narrative essay. It typically, so an example might be describe a community service project you'd like to complete. We see who is someone you admire and why, kind of just they're asking an open-ended question. So Jackie, from the admissions side, can you tell us a little bit, what are you looking for when you're reading an ISEE essay from a student?
Well, certainly. The first thing we look for is whether or not the student actually answered the question. Quite often, the student will start meandering in their thoughts and completely miss that. And so that's the first thing. The next thing, they look for the organization of thought. Introduction, body, and conclusion. These are just, basic formats of an essay. Some students get caught up on whether it should be, 5 or 7 paragraph essay. Quite frankly, have a really strong introduction. If your child has some challenges writing or really coming up with more ideas, having 2 body paragraphs are perfectly fine, and then a conclusion. So if the essay ends up being 4 paragraphs, perfectly fine if they've answered the questions and given 2 supportive reasoning to back up their opinion, or how they, went about completing their service project, and also how it ties up in the end. Always, we encourage students to think about their grammar, try their best to sound out all the words they're going to be using. Punctuation, all of that is key, but most importantly is the content. How did they describe their community service project, right? If the question is, think about someone who's been a huge influence, what are the reasons for it? Answering the question is very important. The writing mechanics is something that students can pick up along the way in middle school and in high school. So remember, they're looked at differently and depending on different entry points. But most importantly is how, creative did the child get with the question, and were they able to fully articulate their reasonings behind a certain topic or opinion or stance they've taken.
Thank you. One thing I see a lot with students, one big point on the essay is it's quality over quantity. So the admissions directors know that you only have 30 minutes. We're not trying to write a novel here. We are really trying to write a super high quality few paragraphs. So that's just something I go over with students a lot. All right, so we're going to jump into scoring on the ISEE because this can get a little complicated. So scoring, you get your scaled score, but then it's transformed into a percentile. So how did you do in comparison with other students who took this test specifically? Then that percentile rank is converted into what's called a stay-9 score. So stay-9s are 1 through 9, and that just reflects where you are percentile-wise. So here is how those stay-9s relate to the percentile. It's a bell curve. So you're going to notice those 9s are extremely hard to get. So a 9 is going to be like 0 to 1 questions wrong. 8's a little easier, but still pretty hard to get. Those are going to be more like 1 to 2 or 3 questions wrong. 7's, now you're getting to more like 3 or 4 to 8 questions wrong, and the gulf gets wider as we go more towards that 5. And so, Jackie, one question I get a lot is, how does scoring, what's a good score? Can you talk about that a little bit?
So for the most part, most students score within a range of 4 and 5 and 6. That is sort of, if your child is taking the CTP5, which is also written by ERB, CTP5 stands for the Comprehensive Testing Program number 5. Children are ranging between 4, 5, and 6. And so when you're thinking about if your child takes it, oh, wow, they've scored, they've gotten a 5, they've gotten a 4, they're never going to get into a school. I want you to walk away that this is kind of the area, the current cohort at the school, especially if it's a kid of 12 and you're coming in from middle and upper, that's where kids are scoring. However, admissions directors want to bring in a stronger cohort. That's true. They want to see where they're at. Can they do a little bit more? Because they definitely want to sort of, that peer effect is important. And so with test prep and careful planning, you certainly can get into, the ranges of, 5, 6, and 7 if you're scoring at 4. There is no absolute perfect score. There's schools use this as a piece of data, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you should know on a national level, students are in that range, and students who are quite talented and are particularly strong in test taking. And I can say that doesn't mean good test scores equate into academic achievement and strong grades, might be ranging 7, 8, and 9. So that, again, I'll save that comment for later, but know that that is the range where most students are scoring. And the goal of test prep is to move the needle from 4, 5, and 6 over to perhaps 5, 6, and 7, in certain cases 8.
Thanks, Jackie. I also want to note, I'm seeing a couple participants joining a bit late. As a reminder, we are recording this. It will be up on our platforms later if you want to go back and check out what you missed in the beginning. I also saw a raised hand. So if you have a question, we are going to have time for questions at the end. But if you want to add it to the chat, if we see it as we move along, we're happy to answer. Okay, so we're going to keep it moving. Another question I get a lot from parents about the ISEE is when can they take the test? So this is another thing that's a bit tricky. The kids can take it only once per season. And so the seasons are outlined on the right. So the fall season is August through November, winter is December through March, and spring is April through July. So most students on a regular testing timeline take one test in the fall season and then another in the winter. Realistically, a lot of schools, I've talked to some very early bird families who are like, well, can we take it in the spring season ahead of the application season? Some schools, I think some schools allow it, but some certainly do not. I think a lot of schools actually don't. A lot of schools want you to wait until August and take it after that. So some families see a benefit in doing almost like a practice, but we really recommend just waiting until that fall season, taking your first test in the fall season and then another in the winter. Now with that winter, something to be mindful of is that you can really only take it at the very latest early January in order to have it ready in time for an application. As much as possible, I'd really recommend taking that second test in December ahead of the holidays. It can be done for people, especially people who get a bit of a later start. You can take it in early January, but from what I've seen, it typically makes the holidays kind of a painful experience. I'd recommend getting it done before the holidays. So now we really, overall, it depends how ready your student is. We tend to recommend taking your first test in October. If you're ready early, maybe September, but more October, at the latest, early November. That way, if you have to take a second test, you have plenty of time to work through anything that may have been challenging on the first one, to go over any topics that you forgot. But it's not too much time where your student starts getting out of the headspace and you're not forgetting topics. So if you take it in August and you can't take another till December, that's quite a bit of time that you're going to have to be maintaining everything you've learned. So again, just to summarize, first test typically in about October, second test in December. So now we've talked a lot about the ISEE. We're going to jump into the SSAT, which stands for the Secondary School Admissions Test. As we go through this, I'm going to be talking a bit about the differences and similarities between the ISEE and SSAT. So the SSAT is a 2.5-hour test, so about the same amount of time as the ISEE. It also has 5 sections, also 4 multiple choice sections and 1 essay. There's also an experimental section at the end. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but that doesn't count towards your score. Each question has 5 answer choices. This is different. The ISEE has 4 answer choices. There is also a guessing penalty on this test. So on the ISEE, if you don't know an answer, just take your best guess. On the SSAT, there is some strategy because each incorrect answer is actually -1/4 of a point. So when students really don't know an answer, there are times where it's best to leave it blank rather than taking their chances. So the strategy behind that is something that varies a bit from student to student based on their knowledge. That's something I'd recommend working on with a tutor or a teacher or someone who's working with a student personally. So the SSAT sections, we're going to run through quickly. It starts with the writing sample. That's the essay. It's unscored. They choose from 2 prompts and they have 25 minutes. So that's 5 minutes shorter than the ISEE. Then there's a quantitative section. That's the first math section, 25 questions, 30 minutes. A reading section, 40 questions, 40 minutes. Verbal, 60 questions, 30 minutes. That's a lot more than the ISEE. Quantitative again, 25 questions, 30 minutes. And finally, we have this experimental section at the end. So the experimental section is actually, it's only 15 minutes. It is 16 questions, a variety of question types. This is actually just the SSAT testing out questions that will be used on future tests. So students should not stress about this. They should do their best. but it won't count towards their score. So let's get started with the verbal section. This section has 30 synonym questions and 30 analogies. So the synonyms you'll remember from the ISEE. Gives you a word, pick the one that is closest in definition. The analogies are very different. So as a reminder, the ISEE had that sentence completion. On the SSAT, you're seeing analogies. So this is to this as that is to that. This, in my opinion, is one of the most test prep strategy focused areas of the test. These are pretty challenging. I talked to a lot of parents who are like, I couldn't figure it out either. So this is one where it's not super intuitive. There are a lot of strategies. There's a lot of, one thing to note is there's a lot of like trick answers that work, but you have to work with the test to figure out which is the right answer that works best. So just as you're preparing for the SSAT, be mindful there is a lot more strategy involved, and a lot of students report it feeling a lot harder on the verbal section on the SSAT than the ISEE. The reading comp section, also quite different. So you have 40 minutes, 40 multiple choice questions, and 7 passages. Now, as a reminder, the ISEE had more direct. We talked about just kind of straightforward passages, either narrative or nonfiction, but just passages as students kind of expect to see them. The SSAT has passages that are more literary fiction. They have poetry. They have all sorts of different topics. These are going to be a little bit more difficult to access sometimes. So that is just something to be mindful of as you're deciding between the two tests. If your student has trouble with that kind of work, they might consider the ISEE as opposed to the SSAT. Another thing to keep in mind, it has a lot more questions about figurative language and language use. So just some different types of questions here. And then the quantitative sections. So there's 2 sections. Their scores are actually averaged to find an overall math score. Again, no calculators, all multiple choice. So the quantitative sections on the SSAT are different than the ISEE in that there is not quite as wide a breadth of topics covered. However, it tends to be a little bit, we will almost say trickier. It's a little bit more critical thinking focus, where students are asked to apply what they know in new formats. So the math, again, it kind of depends what kind of thinker your child is. If they're really good with applying content in new formats, this might be a good choice for them. If they'd rather just study and kind of use what they know in formats that they've seen, ISEE might be better. We're going to get a bit more into ISEE versus SSAT. But now we're going on to the writing sample. Also quite a bit different. So still unscored, but sent to schools. They have 25 minutes. So again, 5 minutes shorter than the ISEE. And they can choose from 2 prompts. Typically, the prompts are a persuasive essay or a creative story. So as you'll remember, the ISEE was a bit more just straightforward, describe something. And this can be like, describe what you believe is the world's most important invention and why. They have to take a stance and make an argument. Or they're given this, creative story prompt. If only I could reach the water's edge. So Jackie, can you tell me from a admissions perspective, are you looking for anything different on the SSAT than you would be on the ISEE?
The SSAT is really fun for directors of admissions because students who choose the creative one, it's just, it can be a lot of fun to read. And sometimes students will leave you on a cliffhanger. What do you think could have happened? And so it's a lot more engaging for directors of admissions to read it, but it doesn't necessarily mean the director prefers one or the other. It's just it's a different cup of tea, right? I would say here's the advantage of taking the SSAT in terms of the writing component. When your child takes the ISEE, you do receive the scores, but you don't receive a copy of the essay. For the SSAT, you receive a copy of the scores along with a copy of the essay. And you're arguing, well, Jackie, you're not going to get scored. I said, no, but you can have a wonderful score and your child completely misses answering the question and only had 3 or 4 sentences. And so you're sitting there like, oh, child would may have known, and you're kind of feeling comfortable, like, well, we got a good score, let's move on with the ISEE. SSAT allows you to make that decision okay, we're going to take this test over, not so much because you've gotten, poor scores, but you failed to answer the question, you lost track of time, you only put 3 sentences. So we can hyper-focus on that a little bit more. So that would be the advantage. You can kind of see the sample of writing and making that decision. I'm not encouraging families to go to the SSAT because of the essay component only, but I just want to say that's one of the perks between both of them, the differences, and you can make a decision of whether or not you want to move forward with the test based on it. Do not be the judge of the writing sample, parents. You're not the judge. At schools, again, we're looking for very different things, mostly following directions and answering the question. And so if you feel like, oh, they could have done better, step away, because we want to make sure that is a representation of who your child really is as a thinker and writer. Again, we know it's only 20-25 minutes. And many times we'll ask for a sample, a graded sample from their school, from their teacher. And we're going to try to see comparisons to make sure this is the child's most authentic voice. And so again, just one little tidbit about the SSAT in terms of getting the essay back over the ISEE.
Great, thanks, Jackie. So we're going to jump a little bit into SSAT scoring and go over how that plays in. So the SSAT is scored by section and then total. So you get your verbal, quantitative, reading, and total score. Then again, they're transferred into percentiles. We don't take the jump into canines with the SSAT, we just stick with percentiles. And as we said, the essay is unscored and won't be sent to schools. The experimental section, just used by the makers of the SSAT, don't worry too much about it. So your score report will come back looking like this. So this is an example of a student who did quite well, 99th percentile. But as you can see, you get a breakdown of your verbal, quantitative, and reading scores. They tell you how well or how many questions you got right or wrong. Actually, on the SSAT or on the ISEE, you also get a similar breakdown of how many questions you get correct or incorrect. And so this is just what you'll be seeing once you get your scores back. So moving forward, when can your child take the SSAT? So there's a lot of, before we jump into it, it's a little complicated. The short answer is you can take it several times. You can take it, students can take it 3 to 4 times if they'd like, realistically. So you can take in-person tests up to 6 times a year, which is the max or almost the maximum they'll take. You can only take computer-based tests, so that's at a Prometric center or in-home 2 times per year, just something to note. And so the future dates are currently unavailable to the public, but my colleague Jackie went to a EMA workshop and they gave us the dates. So they will be on October 12th, November 9th, December 7th, January 4th. And then there's the February and March tests. Again, if you're on a regular admissions timeline, January 4th is going to be the latest that you're going to be taking it. So just something to note here, taking it more times is not always better. However, something to keep in mind if your child is a bit more anxious about these tests, sometimes that ISEE where you can only take it twice, puts a lot of pressure on kids. So if they don't do as well as they want the first time, they go into the second one being like, well, this is my last chance. And they can really, some students get a bit stressed about that. So one benefit to, even if you don't take it that many more times, just knowing you have more opportunities sometimes can help students feel a bit more relaxed going into the test. All right, so just to summarize the key differences, ISEE has 4 answer choices, SSAT has 5. ISEE has no guessing penalty, SSAT has a guessing penalty. ISEE has one nonfiction descriptive essay. SSAT has 1 nonfiction, usually persuasive, and a fiction essay. ISEE can only be taken once per season. SSAT you can take almost as many times as you'd like. Again, there's that limitation with the computer-based tests, but pretty much as many times as you'd like. So Jackie, I would love to know, how are these tests used in admissions?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to go back to the other slide if we could, Leila. I wanted to stress a point. Families who decide to do the computer test base, we found that sometimes the SSAT can be a little bit more challenging. The bot, the person who moderates and proctors a test, it's usually AI. And so if you have a child who really needs a lot of body movement and break, This may not be the best format because the bot is really going to look at your child. So if your child's literally writing and does this for a minute, the prompt will go, please take your hand away from your face. Oh, okay. And if they do this, your eyes on the screen, and if they look one more time, you have been kicked out from the exam. So if you get kicked out from the exam, there's really no way to take it again. So think about who your child is, and if they need body, breaks and self-regulation, they might benefit just being in person or taking at a prometric center where the bot is not doing the proctoring, as opposed to doing it at home. So the SSAT, the ISEE, I feel like the proctors, the way they've designed their platform is offer a little bit more grace for children who just need to, for example, like me, who just needs to move on the chair for 1 second. That was it. That's what I wanted to add to that. So, how do admissions directors use this? Really, we're kind of looking at, we need a benchmark, right? When I'm thinking about boarding schools along the way, when you're at a boarding school, have kids applying from all, the region, even the country and internationally. And so it's helpful to have a benchmark, like, how are they coming in and compared to the other applicants in the pool? Having an understanding that, okay, they seem to be part of the competitive pool, that they can do well. And if they're at a K-12, they seem to be scoring within range of our current cohort because they can translate the percentage, even though the current cohort might be just taking a MAP or a CTP5, they said this child will succeed. So it's helpful to have that benchmark. It's not only a deciding factor, but it allows us to understand how they're performing wherever they're hailing from, right? Especially since so many students, if you're applying to boarding school, are coming from across the country and internationally. And in day schools, there are so many schools in New York City, from public even to private. It's over 70 private and independent schools in New York City. They understand how they would fare in their own little particular sphere and world. So that really kind of helps us navigate that piece. It is an additional piece of data for admissions committee. As I mentioned before, students might be scoring, in the 9s, day 9s, 99 percentile, 98 percentile, and that's wonderful, but they're sort of getting B's and C's in school. What's happening, right? Are they putting in the work? Are they having challenges cooperating, working in collaborative teams and grouping in school? So it just provides one piece of data. It's not going to be the ticket for admissions. Certainly supports it. And so if there's a child coming from a school, I don't really know too much about that school, right? And it only has like 7 or 8 graduates a year. The curriculum doesn't really, speak out to me. I don't understand, kind of the pedagogy behind it. But having that piece of data says, well, at the very least, we know the child can succeed, right? They're coming in above the medium of 50 percentile, right? We know that they're within the current cohort of our group, right? It is not the sole deciding factor. I want to make sure you understand that. And so some schools will say, well, test optional. And they'll say, okay. And then some other schools will say, well, we require, but we only look at the essay. And so it will not be the decision that will decide whether your child's admitted to a school or not. Some schools, as I mentioned, are test optional policies. Well, are they really test optional? Do they really mean that? They do. They truly mean that we are completely test optional. If you want to give us that extra piece of data so that we understand your child's profile a little bit better, since we don't understand the current school too well, we're not familiar, thank you. We welcome it. Some families will say, my child scored really well and we're really proud of it. You want to submit it? You can. It is a test optional school, right? There will be schools that says, please do not submit. We will not look at them or accept them. This is where I urge you not to submit them. If a school has clearly told you we don't want them, even if you've gotten perfect scores, do not submit. That is basically, as a parent, you failing to follow directions. And so as parents, if we can't follow directions, what kind of support are you going to have in terms of your child following directions? So make sure you read the testing policy carefully. Are they required? Are they test optional, or do not submit? Next thing I'd like to talk a little bit more, and I'll let Leila move over to the slide. Next slide.
Jackie, can I ask you a question really quickly?
Sure.
So I know we've had a lot of families asking this lately, so I want to see if you have any information. Just, a lot of colleges we're seeing are moving towards requiring tests. Do you have any sense about what the K through 12 schools are doing about that? And if not, when will we have more information about that for the coming application season?
So as a veteran of working in higher ed and certainly pursuing, further education in the world, what happens in higher ed trickles all the way down to kindergarten. And so if there is a movement to returning to standardized testing, one can expect that the movement will have an impact on high school admissions, middle school, or it'll just keep as far as it can go down the pipeline. And so I do expect schools that were test optional might return to requiring tests. Schools that had a policy of no testing might say we're going to be test optional and transition back to requiring. And so I would watch carefully what's happening in higher ed because it always has an impact. And so what a website might be saying, this is what we require this year for admissions. Make sure you return in July and August because those policies, they have the right to change those policies immediately, especially if the admissions portal does not open until the day after Labor Day. So I think the best rule of thumb as we're moving into the new admission season, prepare to take for the test, to prepare for the test. In the event schools change their policy, you're welcome to call, especially those if you're thinking about boarding schools, to call and like, do you foresee changing the policy? Some schools will say, we do not. We are committing to this policy. That is helpful. But if you don't have the benefit of, working with, having an admissions director who can speak in such confidence, then I certainly say prepare. Which tests should you take? And then you've heard Leila talk about them to some great length right now. And so think about your child's strength. Are they a mathematical thinker? Are they an avid reader? If they're a writer? So if your child is, an incredible mathematician, right? And that is doing, math circles, Russian school math, math Olympiads, math competitions. Sounds like they've really been exposed to quite a bit of math. And so the ISEE might be a good choice, right? Because they've probably seen all that content already. And so there's very little, teaching required, right? Or exposure. They've gotten that. And if they tend to lean and that tends to be their strength, they might prefer straight answer, questions like read this paragraph, this is the question, answer this question, in written format. So they might prefer kind of more direct questioning, both in reading comprehension and verbal reasoning in their essay. And so a child who's that leaning in that direction, the ISEE might be the better choice. But if you have a child who's an avid reader, who's a fantastic creative writer, poet, and really has a fantastic vernacular, I would say, think about the SSAT. They might feel better there, especially perhaps math is not their strength, right? Or they just need to be asked questions that are not, they've covered it, right? Because the exposure in the ISEE is very different to what the SSAT is asking in terms of question. Remember, the SSAT is more of a national test. I think a lot of schools take the SSAT. ISEE has a small applicant pool of students who take this exam, and you'll find a high concentration of students taking ISEE really in the Northeast. So they kind of look at the curriculum for math on a national level for the SSAT. So they try to find what are fair questions to ask. Now, if you have a child who is an exceptional test taker, it doesn't matter what you put in there, decide what they feel better, what they like best to kind of, do they want the freedom to take it a few times, not just be locked into one season? Or do they the kind of student like, listen, I'm going to do great. Let me take it once, do it in September. That's great to have a student that way. But otherwise, think about who they are. So more leaning to mathematical, not so much the humanities, perhaps the ISEE, super duper writer, super reader, creative, but not so strong in math. Then perhaps you want to look at the SSAT because it'll speak to their strength at the very least, right? Day in boarding schools. Historically, boarding schools have always preferred SSAT because that's kind of the niche that they got into years ago when they're looking at students. Day schools have preferred the ISEE. We won't go into the history as to how that happened. Right now, both schools will take both exams. If you are in New York City and you're considering applying to, boarding schools, and your child is that child who is really strong writer or a great reader, but you also want to apply to a few day schools in New York, then I would say take the SSAT Boarding schools usually kind of look to that, and they understand that test a little bit better. And that way, it'll also be accepted in New York City schools. And so you have to think about where your child's applying to. But both schools, right, both day and boarding schools will accept both. I can't think of any school who says, no, you have to give me this. That doesn't exist anymore. It used to be the case about 10 years ago. Merit scholarship opportunities. Now, ISAGNY schools, and there's a lot of New York City independent schools are part of the ISAGNY. You are not allowed to give out merit scholarship. That was one of the things that we agreed on when we all came together and say, what are the rules of engagement for admissions to make this more equitable and even playing field for all families in New York City. No merit scholarship. There are a couple that have been grandfathered in, especially the Butler scholarships with the Catholic schools, Marymount and Sacred Heart, and Regis is in its own thing. But for the most part, it's all based on need. Boarding schools, on the other hand, will offer merit scholarships. So in this instance, taking the SSAT and scoring really well might inform the merit scholarship committee, and could be offered an incredible award that might make the decision for you whether or not you want to go to a boarding school, stay in New York. So that is where merit scholarship comes in when you're looking at boarding schools. And then again, going back to admissions requirements, do you have to take the test? Which one? Well, I told you have the freedom, but if the school says you have to take it, then you take it. If it's test optional, then again, I would go to the one that speaks to the strength, right? Because if they do really well, and even the other side might just almost be of equal measure, you may want to submit it because you're proud of those scores. Okay. Then we'll move on to the next slide. So I'm gonna let Leila, if you want to introduce them a little bit, and then we'll kind of jump in a little bit the distinguishing factors of each school.
Sure. And Jackie, I just want to be mindful of time, so I don't want to spend too much time here because I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. So specialized high schools, if you're preparing for the ISEE and SSAT, we're going to touch on this because a lot of students also are thinking about maybe applying to specialized high schools while they're applying to independent schools. So just to go through, that's Bronx Science, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, the High School for Math, Science and Engineering at City College, High School of American Studies at Lehman College, Brooklyn Latin, Queens High School for Science at York College, and Staten Island Tech. So those are all the specialized high schools in New York. To get into those schools, your child will need to take the Specialized High School Admissions Test, the SHSAT. It has one ELA section and one math section, and it's offered once per year, usually early November. It has some overlap with the ISEE and SSAT, but you will definitely need a separate test prep plan. There are a handful of topics that are a little bit different. Jackie, do you want to talk a little about cutoff scores for the SHSAT?
Absolutely. I think it's really important, if you can take a snapshot, families, of this, is that the deciding factor to being admitted to one of New York City specialized high schools is all based on this test, not attendance, not grades, just your test. So you can see historically, for the last 5 years, Stuyvesant has been ranked #1. The only time Stuyvesant was not ranked was during 9/11, where families didn't want their children in the area. But careful, if you notice, high school math, science, and engineering has now surpassed Bronx Science. It used to be the case that Bronx Science used Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, but the allure of City College is that you can have the math, science, and engineering in a very small community on City College campus, and there's interaction with the faculty, and families really found that incredibly appealing. And having 350, 400 children in the school as opposed to 2,500 students is just something that families feel more comfortable with and children feel more comfortable with. They get the one-to-one relationship there. So again, pay close attention to the rankings, because that is really going to inform you later on and how you're going to rank the schools when the time comes with the Department of Education. But most importantly, it'll give you a real gauge as you prepare and take mocks as to where your child is, scoring and ranging. And this is the one test that I absolutely believe that you need test prep. There is no way around this. This is the one test where you need some real thoughtful and work into this exam. Not that you don't need it for the ISEE SSAT, but it's a very unique one.
Great. I just also want to mention there is one more specialized high school, LaGuardia, I believe, that it doesn't take the SHSAT. It's a portfolio because it's arts-based, right? I just wanted
Absolutely.
to throw that
Yeah.
out there. So just quickly, a recommended timeline. If you're taking the SHSAT, our timeline is going to shift just slightly that we recommend. I would recommend taking your first ISEE or SSAT in September, October. That way, as Jackie said, the SHSAT needs a lot of test prep. That gives you a full month or so to prep solely for the SHSAT ahead of that test, usually early November. Then you have another month to prep for your second ISEE or SSAT in December. So again, this is just our recommended timeline to help you get a sense of like how to move forward. Okay, so now let's talk. Last topic we're going to cover is how should my child prepare for the ISEE or SSAT. So once you make a decision on how to do that, what's next? So the first thing we really strongly recommend is to take a diagnostic test. We offer mock tests in our office or virtually. Also, you can take a test in even a workbook or on Test Innovators, it's an online platform we'll talk about in a moment. But just having a sense of your student's starting point is incredibly helpful. If your student is starting at a really high level, they're not going to need that much prep. We can start now, but we don't have to allot too much time. If your student is not scoring very well and you want to get those scores really far up, you're going to have to make a prep timeline that includes a lot more time allocated. So that diagnostic test we recommend taking now so that you can decide how best to use these summer months as you move forward. So once you take a diagnostic test, you can make a map of your test timeline. And I do really recommend thinking hard about how you're going to use the summer. So a lot of students go to camp or travel. I'm going to tell you, if you're planning for your child to do a lot of prep at camp, it's not super realistic. I've had many kids go off to camp with their materials, kind of stresses them out. And I very, very rarely see kids really getting a lot out of it. So if your child is going to camp or is traveling this summer, I recommend starting soon, doing a lot before that. And then when you get back, having a plan of action moving forward in August. If your child's not going to camp or they're going to be around this summer, then I'd really take advantage of these summer months to prepare. Step 3 is study slowly. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of new content. This is not a test that you do while cramming for, especially during the school year come fall, especially when they're doing essays and interviews and all sorts of other things for the application process. So a couple options for preparation. Of course, there's private tutoring. The benefit to that is you move at a pace that works for your child. You work around your schedule and you're getting high impact feedback on your work at all times. Second option is small group tutoring. So this is, often a bit more affordable than private tutoring, but you still get a high level of personalized attention from a tutor. You have space to discuss, ask questions. You still get pretty personalized assignments. And it also provides that social collaborative aspect so kids don't feel like they're going at it alone. Some kids really benefit from that. So we offer both private tutoring and small group tutoring. Our small group options will be live on our website in the next couple of weeks. We also do, if your child has a couple of friends and you're all going to want tutoring, even just to kickstart tutoring or to kickstart preparation, we can arrange that for you. You just need to reach out to us and we can arrange it especially for you. There's also larger class options. We don't offer that, but you can find those around the city. So these are really good for like a self-motivated student because it does give you a good overview of the topics. It walks them through some of the trickier topics. They can still ask their questions and get some feedback. And one really great thing about classes is it does provide that structure. So they're doing things in a methodical way. It helps them with the timeline. So we do recommend classes for students like that who are self-motivated and just need a little bit of structure. Then, of course, there's independent study. I just want to say, most of these students are going to be 7th, 8th graders. This is for the very self-motivated student. It is possible, but there's some strategy that's just hard to know without someone telling you. And some of these math topics are really hard to work through without guidance. So if you're thinking about independent study, we would recommend maybe even like 2 to 3 sessions with a tutor just to get started, get those preliminary strategies. We also are going to offer a Kickstart tutoring program. So it's going to be 4 sessions, 1.5 hours per session in the fall. So a great kickstart before continuing to prep by yourself. We can also offer that now if, again, your child has a couple friends. So for materials, there are plenty of workbooks. I personally, when I'm tutoring, really like the Tutorverse book. I find it's really organized. It's easy to use. We also recommend Test Innovators. It's an online platform. It has 7 full-length tests and thousands of practice questions. So most of our families find this sufficient for an entire course of preparation. If you'd like to sign up for Test Innovators, if you sign up with us, we can offer a 15% discount. So let me know. You don't have to sign up for tutoring or anything. We're happy to just get you set up. Okay. So that's a lot of last things. I do want to have some time. So again, next steps are diagnostic tests. If you do a diagnostic with us, I will also follow up with a phone call to make a roadmap with you. Otherwise, you can just schedule a call with me. I'm available. We can do an introduction call where I get a sense of you and can give my recommendations for your child and your specific situation. Keep an eye out for our group tutoring. And now we have a little time for frequently asked questions. So Jackie, we have about 5 minutes. I want to make sure I know we have a couple questions. So if we can run through these pretty briefly.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, I think we kind of talked about that. If your child, should you take it on paper and home or at Prometric Center? I think depending, if your child might need accommodations or certain things, you may benefit from taking it at a school that will acknowledge their accommodations or a Prometric Center, depending what needs they might have. The advantage of home is that they have space. You can arrange it according to your schedule. You're not restricted to the date, the national dates, which are listed. You'll find out from ISEE later on in August. You already know SSAT. And so it really depends on the child and what makes sense for them as a learner.
Can I also add though, one also thing to keep in mind, some students really prefer doing the essay virtually. So one perk of Prometric or in home is that virtual aspect. So just something to keep in mind. If your child really likes typing versus handwriting, that could be great.
Can I super score my test? And well, the decision is not up to you. The decision is up to admissions school directors, and it varies from school to school. There is no blanket policy on this approach. And so I think it's definitely something that'll happen at a virtual meeting. You can ask, do school super score? And one will say yes, while another says, no, we really don't do that.
Is there an advantage to sending in 2 sets of scores?
The advantage is that there's a story, right? If the child came out with a headache in the middle of the test and just did not perform well on the, the tail end of the subsections, and they took it again and say, look, this is more balanced, let me give you a story. Yeah, there is some advantage of that. But if your child scored well the second time, there's no need to send in the first one, even if, they got a 8 on the second one, but they got a 9 in, reading comprehension the first one. I don't think it's 1-9 is worth sending both scores. If the last scores were pretty strong, 8 and 7s in the range, 1-9 to an 8 is not going to make a difference.
All right, this is one we get a lot. If my child scores very high in one section and kind of low in another, and then on the next test, they kind of have an average, what do we do there? Which scores do I send in?
Again, if there's a story or a narrative, if the child, was just feeling better this day and then the other, and you can support it in an email, you certainly can send both. But if the average is coming in, again, it varies from student to student. If your average is coming in the 7-8 range, 7-8-9 range, send the average, don't send both of them, So again, it varies from student to student how to best approach this question.
All right, my school asked me to send all my scores. Should I?
The school is asking you to send those scores, and the decision is yours. I think I'll leave it at that.
All right, we have a question in the chat. So if anyone else would like to submit their questions in the chat, we have a few minutes where we can answer yours. So Jackie, one says, How do you help the child who works hard and does not do well on tests such as the NWEA?
Okay. Again, you might be one of looking at schools that are test optional. You may want to look at schools that do not require them. I think, this is hard, and this is where I invite families. You should know if you reach out to us. We'll try to reach out via email if we have. We can have a 15, 30-minute conversation as part of the workshop for attending, where I can go into very specifics about learning who your child in terms of their learning style, and just say, well, this is the kind of approach, the kind of school that you may be wanting looking at. Again, it's just broad, progressive, or more traditional. So, it's difficult to say. There are the more competitive schools, and competitive, I mean schools that get the highest number of applications, which makes them more competitive, are probably going to be looking at test scores, right? And so even though they work really hard, there's so many children in the pool. They have 2,500 children who work really hard and get the scores that it's going to be a little bit more tough sell, right? And so it varies. The
Great.
next question is,
I think that was just a little more context. So it's a child who does well in school, but not like the top of the class. Again, sometimes those students actually do quite well on some of these tests, but then also if your child's, I think as Jackie was saying, if your child is a bright student and they're not a test taker, keep in mind, these are one aspect of an overall application. They are still looking at teacher recommendations. They're still looking at grades. They're still looking at the student interviews. There's a lot of factors.
Yeah, I absolutely encourage you to please make an appointment with us. We'll just talk to you and get through some of those questions. And sometimes the question can be answered in 15 minutes. Save you a whole lot of time.
One last question. If your child scores high in one area, like reading, but they're low in another, like math, how do schools view that?
How do schools view if they scored high in one area and low in the other? I think there will be questions. They want to understand the profile of the school. Is the school's curriculum not designed to expose the child in this one area? Then they'll understand that profile. And so again, it varies from what school you're considering and the sending school. So the receiving school will have their approach on how they look at this test, and the sending school will inform the receiving school. Well, by the time we get to math, we begin to do pre-algebra in 8th grade. So that's a lot of information for this receiving school to know and be like, okay, can we accommodate a child who's coming in with these skill sets into 9th grade? So it varies.
Okay. Jackie, I think one last question, and then we're gonna just wrap up. How good a benchmark are the NWEAs?
You know what? I don't have that information right now in front of me. I would have to look at it. And WEAs, we don't have too many applicants who come in with that score. But I'm pretty good at just looking and understanding, and I can compare it later. So again, welcome you to just give us a call and we'll get that answer for you.
So here, just as we close out, here is our contact information. You can contact Jackie at her email there. You can contact me at my email there as well. I want to thank everyone so much for coming. And so as a reminder, we do have a promotion for participants who came to this workshop. If you purchase a package of 4 or more sessions with our tutors, we will include a bonus complimentary session. So that's 5 sessions for the price of 4. Also, you can email me. I'm happy to hop on a complimentary phone call and discuss your child, discuss a path moving forward. I can also help get you set up with group tutoring, one-on-one tutoring, or a diagnostic test, or even just a Test Innovators account. We're happy to help set that up. And then for guidance on anything with admissions in particular, Jackie will help you out. Again, Jackie can hop on the phone for a quick 15 to 30-minute phone call to talk you through a little bit about your specific situation, your specific child, and give advice on how to move forward. So just as a reminder, we are always here to support you in your test prep journey, in your admissions journey. And thank you again for all coming, and have a great rest of your day.
And one last thing the family was asking,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, for the NWEA, it has multiple tests, right? And so I need to know exactly the map, the region, the school, and the national. So that'll help me. That's what I mean. And that will inform me in terms of what's a good benchmark.
Great. All right, so just being mindful of everyone's time, we're going to wrap up, but thank you all again. Thank you, Jackie, for joining us. And hopefully we hear from you.